Now, I'm sure that all of you have already heard about this book. Certainly, Jason Kohne has advertised it quite a bit. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, in that you've already heard about it, and maybe you've already considered what your thoughts on it might be because you've already heard about it, you've already set your expectations. But what is this book really? Let me come into this as a person who reads a good amount, and I'd say certainly I've said I enjoy Mr. Kohne's work. He and I come from the same state, but I can't say that I necessarily follow him. So that's where I want to start. This book is not exactly narrative, and it's certainly not highly detail oriented. It's a very thin book, very quick read. So what it's not is this big driving narrative. It's not this amazing romantic novella or anything. And it's not a nonfiction book filled with citations and autistic charts. It's also not a book in which you're going to learn a lot of history that you didn't know. On the contrary, what you learn from this book is largely going to be things that you already knew, but you hadn't thought about necessarily. What's really powerful about this book are the everyday descriptions that is able to convey across and get you looking at your world in a very analytical way. It goes with just general descriptions, just things that we all know you've seen, patterns you've recognized, anti-white pretexts that have been involved in your life, and you have to look for them. You have to really investigate if these cues are occupying a portion of your brain and making you think some anti-white thoughts, making you come to some uncertain and anti-moral conclusions, things that are harmful to Western kind. Now, certainly, maybe you think that you understand how to see all these patterns. Maybe you have this detail orientation, something that I have at times perpetuated with all my citations and stuff. But we do need to understand that not everyone thinks in that way. And even for me, even someone who looks at a whole lot of sources, reads a good deal, I still learned a lot just reading through this tiny little book, because I had to, again, look at the world around me. And when I really recognize these patterns in the effective way that Jason is able to put them across, I do think a lot with a lot more certainty. And the certainty, the moral framework certainty that Jason is able to reconstruct is very key. It feels much, much better to start there. And instead of worrying about, oh, we are going to have to go up against this or that, we're going to have to attack this or that. Instead, when you're really driven by this sense of love and recognizing how much anti-whiteism is pervasive, it helps a lot. Because all of a sudden, too, if you just start caring for white well-being, and if you really know how to care for that, or at least maybe there aren't any clear examples right now of where we're going, but you get the idea. You get the idea of how to clear your own mind of anti-white pretexts, and that's crucial. You then therefore get to the point at which you have more certainty than I was able to get with years of, say, the race and IQ debate. Because ultimately, if we're going over the little details, if we're looking at it from a merit, some way here or there, that this group or that group is better at this or that individually, instead of looking at the big holistic picture, you don't get the certainty. If you're looking instead at people, at nations, at a people, at how to define the people and how to define a civilization, and crucial points like how tied a civilization is to the people, or in fact, as he puts it so well, formed of the people, that we are the civilization. Western civilization is within us. So think of that level of certainty and how crucial that certainty is right now, because a lot of you guys, I'm sure, recognize just instinctively how much better the world could be if we were to free ourselves of the old false morality, the morality that keeps harming us. And you already know the ideal of what we would want. But what you and I are otherwise lacking so often is the words to communicate that, and even the thoughts in our head by which we can justify that, because our thoughts have been so infected. I went over recently in Pavlovian anti-whiteism how that is done, how concentrated that is, how consciously it's done to us. And all of that contained in that longer video is something which conforms scientifically to the beliefs which guided Jason in writing this book, in how you can get to people, how you can talk to them, how you can convince them, and also how you can recognize these patterns and convince yourself, which is perhaps one of the most crucial things. Let me read this passage for an example of something that really speaks to me well and helps me to identify my thoughts very clearly, and certainly I think really resonates with the actual function of what we're seeing. From Anti-Whites Are Not Hypocrites. Seeing anti-white hypocrisy is one of the first steps to going free, but the path to true understanding is only opened when you realize that there is no hypocrisy. Anti-white behavior only appears hypocritical when you incorrectly accept anti-white pretexts as the honest reasons for their behaviors. For example, white conservatives are fond of using non-white conservatives to espouse conservative positions. White conservatives believe the anti-white pretext that non-whites and their opinions are especially important and deserve to be yielded or deferred to because of MPs such as historical oppression, legacy of slavery, structural racism, and the like. So, indeed, that's true. That helps me in recognizing patterns, and very effectively, I would say, responds to a whole lot. Imagine, in contrast, all the conservatives that still function in this way. Imagine all the people who have been all the white people who have been excited by Trump, by other nationalist light kind of people that talk about some sort of nationalism but don't really act upon it. And yet they surrender themselves to anti-whiteism. They surrender their interests to anti-whiteism and anti-white pretexts, which is something I've been trying to target more recently and talk about in my videos. But here you have a very structured response to all of that, a structured thinking too, which helps in approaching the kind of work that Mr. Kohne has been doing. Because certainly I was introduced to him just watching his various videos as clips, and doing it that way, it took me a good deal of time to get an idea of the language that he was using. It took me a while to really get at the arguments that he was using. However, organized in this book, you get a much, more organized and more structured way of thinking about all of this. And by the end, you really have thought about pretty much everything that we talk about in long form, but it's a short read. So you can do yourself a favor and get yourself a more holistic view through that. Certainly, one of the parts I particularly appreciate and enjoy and reread actually is towards the end. You just get a series of MPs, that's meme pathogens, and MCs, meme curatives. And so that's sort of a response, offering a very quick response, something that you could just read through quickly and get an idea of how to argue, but also just how to think with a concern for white well-being. Take, for example, here. We are a nation country of immigrants. Oh no, how do we respond to that? Whites can't be immigrants to Western civilization because the West only exists in us. It only exists because we exist. Oh, fantastic. Beautiful. I love it. I love it, love it, love it. How about this one? I don't believe your facts and data. That's not true. I don't believe that. And MC, you mean you don't want to believe it because you are anti-white. And that goes with the very effective meme curative, as well as just the morality that you need to embrace in your life if you really care about white well-being, which is, if your conclusion is anti-white, I reject it. Because after all, their conclusion is anti-white, and it is contributing to anti-whiteism. It is contributing to something that you can very easily exhibit as the regime which is anti-white, which is biased against white people consistently and has been for a very long time. But as I said in my Pavlovian anti-whiteism video, the real issue here is the amount of conditioning we've gone through and how consciously that conditioning has been constructed. But science, as well as Mr. Kohne, seem to say that getting people to recognize the cues through one means or another, but just getting people to recognize these cues helps them to understand that they are being conditioned in this way towards anti-whiteism. So here, if you think of this as a beginner's class, advanced class, you can see that because this is so foundational, it can actually be good for a lot of people. If I consider my kind of content and my kind of thinking at this point like a advanced class essentially, then I still learned something about my own conditioning. I can still a little bit better identify these anti-white memes. I can still pick up on some very effective responses which I had not thought about before. In particular, while recognizing how pervasive and institutionalized this conditioning is, it makes a lot of sense to have a very organized practice of self-reflection. And in that way, this crucial way of framing language thinking consistently, this is how it can really help us who may have been at this for a while. See, Jason calls it something like immunity, gaining immunity, training ourselves to recognize. But another way you can think about this in more of an internet terminology would be training yourself against cucking, making it harder to cuck, which is very important. And meanwhile, for the beginner, it really takes them through in a way that they won't really have the opportunity to question, because really the question for them is just, do they keep turning the pages? And if it's short enough, if it's just engaging enough, they will keep turning the pages. And that's what makes it a really good book to start people on. So for all those different levels, everything that I'm mentioning here, it does get my recommendation. It's good to read, it's good to reread, and that's kind of how it's used effectively. It's good to put it into your mind and use it in your daily life to try to think a little bit better, recognize a little bit more, notice a couple more patterns, and crucially, you become someone good, someone heroic, someone who is the only person doing good. You can bring more people into that. That's how they come in as beginners. So welcome one and all. It's a great thing to spread around, and even if you just use it linguistically, yeah, it will help. It's going to surprise you when you really take a moment, step out of the news even, and think to yourself, reflect a little bit. I think it will do some surprising things to you, and I think that it could also do some surprising things to the people in your lives who need it also. Best of luck, stay strong, but most of all, build a community around yourself. There can and will be an amazing future out there, eventually, for our people.